These are peptides being marketed for things like recovery, growth, muscle growth, fat loss, longevity. That's a big one, longevity.
I'm certainly seeing in my ecosystem that there's a lot of women that are educated, that are really smart, but they're coming to me and they're saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Right? Their knees are hurting, their elbows are hurting. Could this work for them?
99% of ideas do not become new drugs. If you look at just the preclinical, so just the cellular and the animal studies, more than 90% of ideas fail to make it through preclinical to have permission to go into human trials. So it's truly a completely unquantified benefit or risk at this point when humans are consuming these things that are being marketed for research use only, but people are selling them saying that they do everything.
Welcome back to Stronger by Design. I'm Michelle MacDonald, your host, and today's conversation is one I think every woman navigating menopause, recovery, aging, or optimization needs to hear, because right now peptides are being marketed as the answer to everything. Fat loss, longevity, healing, hormone support, joint repair, better sleep, better recovery, better aging. And social media is flooded with promises. But here's the question almost nobody is asking. How much of this is actually supported by human evidence, and how much of it is marketing moving faster than science? My guest today is Leigh Baxt, PhD, a translational and drug development scientist specializing in the interface between basic biology and therapeutic development. She's worked across more than 30 therapeutic programs spanning oncology, metabolic disease, infectious disease, and regenerative medicine, with expertise in how potential drugs move from early scientific concepts into real-world clinical testing. Leigh earned her PhD in microbiology and immunology from Stanford University School of Medicine, completed postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School, and brings a rare perspective to this conversation because she works inside the actual process of drug development. And what she explains today is staggering. Guys, more than 99% of therapeutic concepts fail before ever becoming approved treatments. So when women are being sold research peptides online with claims around healing, anti-aging, and optimization, we need to ask harder questions about evidence, risk, marketing, and informed consent. This episode is not anti-science, it's pro-data, pro-critical thinking, and pro-women making informed decisions instead of emotional ones. We're going to talk about why peptides have exploded so quickly, where the science actually stands, what most people misunderstand about animal studies, and why randomized controlled trials matter, the psychology behind wellness marketing, and how women can better protect themselves in a space increasingly driven by hype instead of evidence. And importantly, Leigh does not represent her employer in this conversation. All views expressed are entirely her own. Let's get to it. All right, so let's dive in. Peptides. We're going to drill down to how women are being misled. And I want to open up hard here, right? Women are being sold peptides as the answer to all kinds of things, right? Aging, fat loss, menopause, every symptom under the sun. But how much of this is actually evidence-based? And I'm talking to Leigh Baxt, who is an expert in this area around drugs and how they make it to market. And so we're going to sit down and get real with peptides and what's happening. The goal, we want to separate the actual science from the marketing. So, Leigh, can you tell us why have peptides exploded so fast? And tell us a little bit about what peptides are.
So peptides are just short chains of amino acids. They're just small pieces of what would become a protein. Proteins are made of many peptides. The peptides we're talking about are wellness peptides. These are peptides being marketed for things like recovery, growth, muscle growth, fat loss, longevity. That's a big one, longevity. We're not talking about FDA-approved drugs, which happen to be peptides like insulin or GLP-1 agonists. We're also not talking about people who are just making copies of the GLP-1 agonists and selling those through compounding pharmacies. We are talking about things like BPC-157, TB500, and many others. These are all being marketed for pretty much everything under the sun, like you said. And by and large, most of that marketing is based on data from animals or cells, and in very few cases, humans. We don't have clinical trial data with appropriate controls and randomization. We don't even have the preclinical data. And in many cases, we don't even know the molecular target of the pathway that they're affecting. There's a lot of potential benefit, but also potential risk, and we simply can't quantify that yet because we don't have the data.
So let's dive into numbers because we were talking about this offline and the numbers and the fail rate of ideas, right? So something might have a good kind of mechanistic reason why it could work theoretically, but then it never even makes it to human clinical trials, or it never makes it to even being able to petition for FDA approval. And those numbers are staggering. I think women in the audience really need to understand this, right? So you said something very interesting. You said we've got FDA approved peptides out there like insulin and GLP-1s. And there's decades, right, of research going into these things getting onto the market. Then we've got these other peptides, these wellness peptides that aren't even making it through human clinical trials. And a lot of them don't even, haven't even made it past sort of that first stage of like, hey, this is a good idea. They never even make it to, hey, could we successfully get this into human clinical trials? So tell us a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about what happens, the whole process from idea to getting FDA approval.
Absolutely. I'll tell you a little bit about the process and also the failure rates. So the first thing to know is the majority of things fail. 99% of ideas do not become new drugs. If you look at just the preclinical, so just the cellular and the animal studies, more than 90% of ideas fail to make it through preclinical to have permission to go into human trials. If you look at the start of human trials to approval, again, 90% fail. So you're talking about a 1% success rate, if that. And this is dependent on the disease indication, the type of medication that you're developing. But by and large, the failure rates are still very high. Now, when you're going to develop a new medication, generally we do something called target-based drug discovery. So we have a drug target that we want to affect. And we develop a molecule that can affect that target in the way we want to affect it. We understand all the molecular pathways that are affected. We understand all the potential risks and benefits because we have a complete understanding of the biological mechanism. Then we go into animal studies where we make sure that it's both safe and efficacious. And there are very specific studies that you're required to do to de-risk your idea to show that it works in lots of different animal models and that it doesn't have specific risks that we know exist on different biological pathways. So, for example, many of these peptides are promoting things like VEGF or growth factors, pathways that we also know happen to be dysregulated in cancer. Not saying wellness peptides will give you cancer, just saying that they perturb pathways we know are associated with cancer, and any therapeutic that affects those would have to go through a de-risking step before even moving to human clinical trials. So you're skipping all of that. So now let's say we've got through all those studies and we've submitted what's our IND, our investigational new drug application. That's what it's called in the small molecule space. It's called different things in other modalities. We get permission to go into clinical trials. Now we go through all three phases, 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is focused on safety. Phases 2 and 3 are larger, and they're focused on both safety as well as efficacy. And often we compare to any other standard of care that exists. Once you get through that entire process, then you can apply for approval. And it takes billions of dollars and usually about 10 to 15 years to go through that. Most of these wellness peptides are like just the very beginning of preclinical. Maybe they're like a little way through preclinical. But for many of them, we don't even know the target. So yes, you can find something with an interesting biological function, but you would still need to understand the target and the pathways before you can start moving through development. We don't even have that data. So it's truly a completely unquantified benefit or risk at this point when humans are consuming these things that are being marketed for research use only, but people are selling them saying that they do everything.
That's a huge play on the vulnerability of people
Absolutely.
in this space, right? And I think that it's a gap that's closing, but we've got, a healthcare system in crisis. We have historically women's health being largely ignored. And I'm certainly seeing in my ecosystem that there's a lot of women that are educated, that are really smart, but they're coming to me and they're saying, "What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" Right? Their knees are hurting, their elbows are hurting. could this work for them? I saw it with the sort of compounded hormones, the not the peptides, but the pellets, right? The testosterone pellets. I've had so many women try these pellets, and then of course they're ending up with free testosterone in the 300s, right? So now I'm seeing it happen with peptides, and I'd love to talk about the BP-157 because I feel like that's probably one of the most overhyped peptides out there, and people really, I follow all these different accounts and I see how it's sold by experts even, as well as those best friend influencers, right?
Yep.
The girlfriend next door, like, look at my amazing transformation,
Yep.
hit the link and use my code. And so I'm really seeing it out there again and again. And when people are marketing it, it absolutely sounds like there is a ton of evidence, or there's strong evidence. And we were talking offline about that. Like, I don't know how many studies on BP-157 there are, whether it's actually in clinical trials or not. So could you help us understand that one?
Yeah, so there's a couple red flags with BPC-157. Number one, most of the preclinical kind of basic science on it comes from a very small group of researchers in one geographical area. And we have not seen wide reproduced science across multiple countries, different groups of investigators and different universities. That's always a red flag. You always want to build something for therapeutics on scientific consensus, meaning that it's been repeated by lots of different reputable labs in different places. If it's strong biology, it should hold up when you move it across and expand it to others. We always look for something called a dose response. So when you give more of it to an animal, you see a greater response. And in the literature for BPC-157, we don't see a consistent dose response for the different pathways that are being called into play for the various functions. So that's a red flag. It is not in human clinical trials. There is one phase 1 trial that was registered more than a decade ago. It was suspended or canceled. There were no results ever published, and no one has conducted one since then. There are, I think one or two very small, like a total of maybe 30 humans, like not mechanistic, but like descriptive clinical studies. But they're like patient-reported outcomes like pain level. They're not hard clinical endpoints that you would need to measure to do proper RCTs. And there's no randomization. There's also no control arm. So I can't tell you how many times I get people commenting on my posts saying, I used BPC-157 and it healed my torn rotator cuff in a month. And I'm happy that people feel good. I want people to take charge of their health, but I want them to do it in a way that's well-informed and based on data and evidence and safe, most importantly, safe. And you don't have a comparator. If you injected yourself with it and you didn't have a clone with the same injury who wasn't injected, there's no control. You have no idea what your healing trajectory would have been without it. So it's truly not possible to quantify the benefit or the risk of something if we don't have data.
And I think, again, if we go back to the numbers that you said earlier, right, like 90% of ideas don't even make it to clinical trials. And then of the ones that do, 90% don't make it past phase 3, right? And there's a reason for that. Like over the years, right, and increasingly that system for vetting drugs and whether or not they are viable for human consumption, that process is becoming incredibly detailed out due to things making it to the market that ended up causing terrible outcomes. And of course, I remember I grew up in the era of thalidomide. Right?
Yeah.
And there have been other things that have happened since then, or even misuse of, or, not talking about the actual contraindications around something. So we have the oxytocin, right? Like, okay,
Yeah.
That was another disaster for different reasons.
Yeah. Where marketing and prescription usage really ignored the science.
2 + 2 = 4, right? So we're seeing completely skipping this very vetted process that's put into place because of disasters that have happened, right? And in a free market economy, we don't just want anyone. I mean, the drug industry is a $1 trillion industry, and it's probably one of the few industries that is successfully sued year after year, and is still one of the best ones to profit from a Wall Street perspective. So we want to make sure that we're keeping these processes guardrailed. Yet here we have seemingly a loophole where actual doctors And I'm surprised people can't, that like they're able to, have their license. Like doctors and experts are promoting these as though they were safe, and we've got robust evidence saying that they're safe. But
Yep.
but you're saying, no, we don't. And if I look at BP-157, which is the most heavily touted, and I'm sure there's some people listening to this that maybe even are using it and are thinking, yeah, but it works for me. And I mean, talk about bias, right? Like,
Yeah.
and the placebo effect and how real that is against that concern of we don't even know the downstream effects and of using this. And then also, if you have anything underlying that might get triggered, and that would get fleshed out potentially in those human clinical trials. And then I would also love for you to talk about what happens during the testing where you are looking at drug interactions, right? Because I think of my American clients and friends, a lot of them are taking several things, right? How do these, what happens when certain pathways are getting triggered and we've got drug interaction? Could you talk a little bit about that piece of the puzzle too? Because I just want people to understand, if you're making a choice, make it informed and then do your due diligence afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that doctors always ask, are you taking any supplements, any vitamins, or anything else? Because they need a full picture of everything that's going into your body, because there is a very real possibility that drugs can interact with one another, and that you could be taking two things that by themselves are fine, but together there may be some type of negative effect that could make it worse, or one could make the other behave in a much more potent manner. So studying drug-drug interactions is something that happens much later in the process. I work in the very early preclinical, where the 90% failure before you get to the clinic, that's where I work. But later on, studying drug-drug interactions is absolutely a huge part of the process. And if you want to develop a drug that has multiple active ingredients in it, you have to study it preclinically and clinically in that mixture. You have people out here stacking all these peptides together, and we have no idea, number one, how the biology of all those pathways will be affected at the same time. And number two, when you put them together in the vial, we don't even know what will happen to that.
And beyond peptides, right? I'm seeing, like I said earlier, I'm seeing gals stacking all kinds of things as well, right? So compounded hormones, we've got pellets out there. I have people on oral and topical estrogens. It's turning into the Wild West, and there seems to be more, especially with AI and AI marketing. There seems to be more marketing and landing pages and sales funnels popping up right, left, and center.
Yeah, and I also find it particularly disturbing that I'm seeing clinicians, DOs, MDs, other people in healthcare who are promoting these. And there's always a connection to either like their clinic offers peptide therapy, so there's a direct financial incentive, or there's an affiliate code or coupon code. There's usually some type of connection. And I've asked a number of these people, like I've seen them promoting these things on Instagram, and I've said, like, how do you give informed consent to your patients? And they'll lump them together with GLP-1 agonists, like it's just another peptide. But those are very different levels of evidence that are available. One of these is a robustly studied in human clinical trial approved drug, and the other is something that has none of that data. So I always ask them, like, how are you marketing this? I always give all my patients informed consent. I'm like, well, what does that informed consent sound like? Because the only true informed consent for that is, here's something, it's interesting in animals. We don't know what it will do in your body or whether it will translate. We don't know what dose, we don't know what risk, and we don't know what benefit, but here you go. And who's going to take that? Nobody's going to buy that. And there's doctors who I've seen who have pages where they'll show like a cartoon outline of a body, and they'll show something like TB500, and then they'll show the different body systems that it affects. There are no human studies on TB500, period. There is a parent peptide that it is a fragment of called TB4, and there are studies on TB4, but you cannot extrapolate biology on a giant peptide to a little piece of that peptide, because every tiny molecular change can impact how it behaves at every step of the process. You can't just say, this peptide has interesting biology in humans, and therefore injecting it will do the same thing. That's exactly why 90% of ideas are failing in the preclinical space. And that's what my day job is. Can we take this interesting biology and turn it into something that can be harnessed therapeutically? And basically finding the holes in those hypotheses and proving why they may not work is a huge amount of what I do at work.
I was on another podcast, I can't remember who it was with, but we were talking about the trickle down effect of I don't know if it's trickle down effect, but like the trickle down of information at the research level to the practical level, right? So if you're, maybe it was Jen Gunter, like if you're graduating from medical school, right, then the onus is going to be on you to stay concurrent with the evidence.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we get it. The medical system is strained. We've got people working some ridiculous hours. And
Yep.
how do you stay on top of this stuff? And it becomes very easy to get influenced, because we're all human, to be influenced by social media yourself, especially when we see some really big names from Harvard or
Yeah.
Stanford on big podcasts like Mel Robbins or Huberman, and you see these people getting a lot of traction. It becomes very confusing, and you've got people coming to you, patients demanding stuff. That's a reality.
Yep.
That happens. We need this
Oh, yeah.
stuff, right? If you don't do it, I'm going to find somebody who will, or whatever. And so I can see how things are ending up the way they are, but it also means that we do have to keep shining that light on what informed consent is, and keep encouraging this discourse. That's why I use my platform the way I do, to get the information out there so people can make informed choices.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think that, a big reason that I started making content on Instagram in the first place is because I was so frustrated with seeing what was happening to science and the trust in science. I mean, last year, because of all the changes to scientific funding, my spouse, who's a researcher, lost a huge amount of his NIH funding for a really important infectious disease. The not-for-profit I worked at was shut down, so I lost my job. And I'm just watching all of my friends and colleagues who are mostly in science and medicine go through this and see this like undermining of scientific trust and processes. And I don't want to say that there aren't issues. There are issues in every industry. Yes, there are places that can be improved. Absolutely. But as someone who works in this space, I feel like, I have a responsibility to share with the greater public, people who aren't in science, like, why am I doing this work? Why is it important? Why is it exciting? And how can we use this information to give people, to give them power over their own lives? Like, I want people to be informed. I want them to understand what data does and doesn't exist. Most importantly, I want them to be able to differentiate data from marketing, because even the most seasoned scientists, my mom is a retired cancer researcher, postmenopausal woman in her 70s, doesn't like lots of the things happening to her body. And even she will be like, did you see this? And she'll send me something and I'm like, no, see the discount code? Like, and she knows what to look for. Like I tell her all the red flags, and she's a scientist. So the marketing is it's so psychologically manipulative and it's so compelling that it's really easy to get sucked in. And I think, you have to look for content, like, is it emotion inducing? Is it an emotional response that you feel? Is it sensational sounding? Is someone telling you that there's a secret? Because I don't know how many scientists you've talked to, but we want to tell you everything. Like, we're not keeping secrets. We're like, let me tell you all the things. I could do 2 hours of this podcast and tell you all the things I know ad nauseum. We're not hiding it.
Speaking of which, I want you to share your podcast and the group of scientists that are really promoting evidence-based information for people.
Yeah. So I work with the Unbiased Science team. I do some of my own content, but I followed Unbiased Science for years. Jess Steyer started it during the pandemic, and it has really expanded. And I followed for many years. Then I started making my own content, and I got a message from Jess that was like, so do you want to join our team? And there are, I think at this point, probably 50 of us who basically volunteer our expertise to help put content together. I went on her podcast. I was on Simon Hill's podcast. I've got a bunch more coming up. We're just like volunteering our time to talk about our expertise and our little niches of science, because we just want people to understand it and we want to make it accessible. I want everyone to be able to understand how medicines are made, how we make sure they're safe, and how we make sure they're working. Because I don't want you to feel nervous when you go to the doctor and they say you might need this new medication for something. And it sounds scary when you hear all the side effects. I want you to understand why those things are listed as side effects and why we know that the chances are this will help you rather than harm you.
I'm so glad you said that. Certainly, I consider myself, I'm a lover of science. I'm a lover of knowledge. And I think there are so many great people out there, experts and doctors, really doing incredible things, getting into social media and sharing information. I think every time I open my Instagram, I see Alyssa Olenek putting up with her whiteboard, putting up some information and really try to, get the science out there to people so they're not afraid to do HIIT training, or they're not afraid to do some cardio. They're not afraid to lift heavy because of the onslaught of disinformation that we're seeing out there. And it's amazing to see. I think, to kind of bring this to a close, I want to go back a little bit. You had said before, offline, that if people wanted to do their own follow-up, that it's, whether or not there's a peptide in human clinical trials, that there's a relatively easy way to do that. Could you explain that to the listeners?
Yeah, if there's a peptide you're interested in and you want to see if there are clinical trials being performed, and this is US centric, the website where clinical trials have to be registered is publicly accessible. It's called ClinicalTrials.gov. You can search for your favorite peptide. I actually did this last weekend. I searched all the popular peptides because I was like, what's happening? Are there new trials out here that I don't know about? Because if there are registered trials that are actually currently going on, this doesn't mean descriptive trials that haven't started, but things currently going on. It does mean that there was some data provided to get that permission, because you can't just do a registered trial without providing that preclinical package. So you can go to ClinicalTrials.gov and look up the, disease of interest, the peptide of interest, or the drug of interest, and you can see what's there. It's a little clunky and, it takes a little time to kind of get used to what you're looking at. And sometimes you see things registered that aren't actually trials. They're like a description of a theoretical trial. I discovered that recently in the peptide space specifically for BPC-157 and TB500, which is another disturbing thing, but for another day.
Gotcha. So you might see something appearing there, you said, but it's a descriptive trial versus an actual.
Yeah, you can see if they're currently recruiting or if it's just in planning. It'll kind of give you a status for the trial. So it's important to look at.
Oh, that's sneaky.
Yeah. You need to look at who's doing the trial, like who's the contact person, where is it being done, who's sponsoring it, what exactly are they registering, and then how much detail. And if the trial is completed, there should be links to the evidence, like the data that you can also see. And a lot of times those data then get published so you can find the papers.
Beautiful. I think that's really important to flag, because we're looking, the sort of the off-label market, if you will, where the non-FDA market is just exploding right in front of our eyes, especially in the States. And so be on the alert for those kind of practices. Just because you see something in those ClinicalTrials.gov doesn't mean that it's what you're actually looking for. You want that concrete evidence that there's human trials actually in play. And then in that space, we've got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, 90% fail during that course. So just registering isn't enough. Okay. Just registering isn't enough. Really unpack that a little bit. I'd like to do one last thing, which is, and I'm not sure how much you can talk about it, Leigh. I know in the bodybuilding world, you hear about this all the time. These Olympians, bodybuilders are, know what they're doing. They're using drugs, they're stacking them, but they also are working with a medical professional, and they're really doing a lot of crazy blood work. Like they're probably bodybuilders are probably the most professional bodybuilders are probably the most
lab rat like.
Most lab rat like. They're the most involved in following their data, really knowing their lipids, their LDL scores, their liver enzyme scores. They're probably the most aware of the amount of time they should be on these things, right? Because they're really aware of the risks. They're willing to run those risks. And so we've got this blind spot, like I said, not only with peptides, but also people taking all kinds of compounded hormones where we don't have that strict regulation that we do with FDA-approved things. And for whatever reason, we're seeing that explosion, especially in the female market. So do you have anything to say about that in terms of getting blood work done, or can you defer to somebody else that could?
Yeah, I mean, in the space of the kind of metabolic health and peptides and things, there are lots of amazing content creators out there. The Naldowski brothers, I really like. They're both physicians who have very common or really well-known pages on Instagram. They talk a lot about these because, like, for example, Retta, the retatrutide, I think is how you say it. I'm not going to say it right. It released really amazing phase 3 data, and people are really excited about it, and they're using it, and it's this triple agonist. But the video he released is like, yeah, the data is really exciting, but you should still wait for approval, because the other dynamic here we haven't talked about is that the sourcing for these isn't regulated. There's no regulation for the purity, the sterility, the stability, what's in the tube, how much of it. Like these gray market peptides, like there's no framework to make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting. If they get moved from category 2 to 1, where they're allowed to be compounded, there will be some oversight applied, nothing near the level of what's applied to the pharmaceutical industry, but it's better than nothing. So yes, there's compelling and exciting data, even when you see the things in clinical trials. But like for me, I want something that's FDA approved, that's gone through all the manufacturing processes as well. And I know that it's all been vetted, and that from end to end, we understand the biology and the manufacturing, the dosing, and everything. The one other point we didn't touch on that I'd just like to add for your audience, because I'm sure they've heard this one. A lot of people like to say that the pharmaceutical industry is not interested in peptides because they can't patent them. And yes, there is a rule that you cannot patent naturally occurring molecules. But when you develop something to turn it into a therapeutic, it goes through changes to make it more drug-like, meaning that it will stick around longer, it gets to the tissues it needs to get to, or it binds to the receptor better. All those changes give you the position that you can now patent it. So there are lots of patented peptides, even the wellness peptides that haven't been through clinical trials. There are multiple peptides on BPC-157. So the lack of ability to patent is not the reason that these aren't being pushed
Thank you
through.
for pointing that out, because I know people are going to be thinking about that one. Again, these arguments that we're hearing by the peptide pushers, they sound sciencey. They sound real. They sound legitimate. But one of the reasons I invited you on, because you're just like a machine gun, like tack, 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 like no. And I love that we have so many peptides that have been through FDA approval that we think of as everyday, drugs like insulin, right? And now we've got the GLP-1s, and so it's just so illogical. There's this cognitive dissonance, right? It's just illogical to think that you can't patent it. We've got evidence, lots of evidence that you can.
Yeah. We're actually going to be doing a series of 2 Instagram carousels in the upcoming probably month or so with Unbiased Science on peptides. We're going to do one on what are the peptides people are talking about, and just a high-level overview. But I also have an intellectual property lawyer who is working with us on the second one, and we're going to talk about the patenting rules, the regulation, and all that other stuff. So between those 2 carousels, that should address a lot of the very common pushback you get from people when you talk about peptides. So I'll definitely make sure to share that on my page for anybody who wants to see it. And I'm always happy to answer questions if people have them. Find me on Instagram at ScienceMomPsycom. Just send me a message and I'll be happy to answer.
Love it. So just to sum up quickly, we've got these staggering numbers, right? We've got 90% fail rate just going from idea through animal studies to even petition to get into human clinical trials, 90% fail rate. Then of the molecules that make it successfully into human clinical trials, we've got another 90% fail rate, right? So we've got a 1% success rate from idea to FDA approved drug. We know that to get that FDA approval, there is just such robust oversight. And there's a reason for that, right? For past drugs that made it to market that had these negative downstream effects. So know that, right? You can also check to see if your favorite peptide, where it is in human clinical trials. Just be aware of the difference between just registering something and actually being in trials. And then the other piece that I would want listeners to know about is just to stay actively involved, be your own health advocate. If you are going to experiment, right, which I totally get, make sure you're working with a qualified professional and do the blood work and just stay on top of things, and be also aware of contraindications of drugs interact with each other. Thank you so much. Would you add anything else to that?
There are not blood tests for everything. There are things that could be happening that we won't catch on a lab. So I am fully supportive of, always having good medical oversight, I get my blood work done every year. But there are some things that you're not going to be able to find on blood work. And that's part of the reason that we want the risk to be quantified before people are going all in on these
I'm
things.
so glad you brought that up. I meant to say that, right? Like, be truly aware of the risk factors, right? So if you are trying something that is not FDA approved, is not even in phase 2 clinical trials, isn't even in phase 1 clinical trials, understand the risk, right? Like,
Yeah.
I like to say none of us is getting out of this alive. We're all aging. And I think the big levers that we like to pull, right, when it comes to sleep, managing your stress, making sure you have very healthy social relationships, and then, of course, exercise, cardiovascular exercise, resistance training, like staying on top of those things, staying on top of your nutrition. Those are the big levers. Really no negative downstream effect. And if you're going to stack something on top of that, understand the risk versus the reward, and what the science actually says about it. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Michelle.
All right, a few things stand out for me after this conversation. First, science is slow for a reason. The therapeutic approval process exists because biology is complicated, human beings are complicated, and history has shown us what happens when excitement outruns the evidence. Second, women are not irrational for wanting solutions. Women navigating pain, fatigue, menopause, injury, aging, or body composition changes are often underserved, dismissed, or overwhelmed by a healthcare system that can feel fragmented and reactive. That vulnerability creates the perfect environment for emotionally charged marketing. But the conversation needs to shift from fear to discernment. Being evidence-based does not mean being closed-minded. It means understanding the difference between a compelling mechanism, an animal study, anecdote, early-stage research, and actual human clinical outcomes. As Leigh said so clearly today, raising concerns isn't being anti-peptide, it's being pro-science and pro-data. If this episode challenged your thinking, please share it with another woman who needs to hear it. Leave us a review, drop it on your socials, and help us continue building a space where women can think critically, ask better questions, and make informed decisions about their health. And if you're ready to stop chasing shortcuts and start building a stronger body through evidence-based training, nutrition, and accountability, my next 24-week transformation program is opening soon. To join the waitlist, email hello@thewonderwoman.com.